Romani Entrepreneurial Magic and the Persuasiveness of Ritual Deception. Sleight-of-Hand as Artifice of Magical Power. Part 1. The Great Trick. In 1841, George Burrough, an agent of the English Bible Society who had spent the late 1830s distributing Bible translations in Spain, published a two-volume work entitled The Zincali, or an account of the gypsies of Spain. This work, along with later fictionalized descriptions of gypsy life, made Burrough into a founding father of the folkloristic study of Europe's Romani minorities, exerting an outsized influence on the British gypsy lorists in particular. Among the influential themes that Burrough introduced in the Zincali was something that he called the Hokanobaro, or great trick in Romani. Essentially a confidence game that he attributed to the gitanas, or gypsy women of Spain. This great trick was about winning the trust of a wealthy and credulous person, promising to multiply their riches through magic. In its simplest form, Burrough tells us, the trick is achieved by convincing the client that an enchanted treasure can be attracted by burying one's own money in the ground. While the client sleeps, however, the gypsy woman collects the spoils and runs away. More elaborate versions would deploy rituals, props, and accomplices to persuade and misdirect the client. For instance, the client could be told that her gold and silver can be multiplied by wrapping it in a special blessed handkerchief, which is to be tied with 3 knots and tucked under the pillow for 3 nights. She may open it in the mornings to check that all is in order, but under no circumstances must she tell anyone else about the operation. If she does, the money will take wings and fly away. After 3 days, the gitana returns. They inspect the bundle together and proceed to lock it in a sturdy chest to which only the client has the key. At this point, however, the gitana deftly substitutes the handkerchief for an identical one containing nothing but scrap metal. The client is told to wait and pray for 3 more weeks without peeking inside of this bundle, and the money will then have grown tenfold. Meanwhile, of course, the gitana walks away with the gold and silver, never to be seen again. Now, the association of gypsies with magic, deception, and fraud was far from new with George Burrough. We can trace this complex to some of the earliest chronicle accounts of the arrival of the people from Little Egypt in the early 1400s. In fact, an ambiguous pair of stereotypes has followed Europe's Romani people since the beginning. One, that their women have dangerous but desirable magical powers, and two, that their magic is all fraud. By the mid-1500s, the latter image of the gypsy women who trick people with fake fortune-telling had become a fixed trope in both narratives and artistic representations of who the gypsies were. Sebastian Münster's highly influential Cosmographia Universalis, for instance, portrayed the Zigeuner as a lazy race supported only by the fake fortune-telling and thievery of their women. Now, following Burrough, the phrase Hokanobaro became a shorthand in the emerging international literature for these old ideas of the fraudulent, insidious nature of gypsies. It appeared in German the year after the Zincali was published, when Carl von Heister compared the Hokanobaro of the Spanish gitanos to how German Zigeuner tricked farmers into buying bogus cures for their livestock, who were made to look like they were sick and needed cures. In Scandinavia, the Norwegian priest and pioneering social scientist Eilert Sundt drew heavily on Burrough in his state-commissioned work on the Norwegian Romani population, Tatere or Romanisel, paying much attention in his work to how quote-unquote gypsy women or tatersker exploited the superstitions of the common people. Now, to 19th century scholars, the apparent similarities of practice between Romani populations in Spain, Germany, Scandinavia, and the British Isles suggested a shared tradition of extra-European origins, an Oriental tradition in the middle of Europe. The case was made partly on pseudo-etymological grounds. George Burrough already speculated that the English terms hoax and hocus were derived from, quote, the language of the gypsies, who had, he thought, first introduced the system into Europe to which those words belong. Now, Eilert Sundt likewise noted that what the Spanish gypsies called Hokanobaro, the Scandinavian Tatere called Baro Kokkipa, or also Summipa, a Scando-Romani term with the double meaning of sorcery, witchcraft on the one hand, and trickery or fraud on the other. This, according to Sundt, proved that the practice that these terms belong to was thoroughly something that the gypsy people had produced and had brought with them to the various countries of Europe. Finally, the self-made American folklorist Charles Godfrey Leland, who was also the first president of the Gypsy Lore Society, established in 1888, continued Burroughs' etymological speculations, listing as evidence the Anglo-Romani terms hockben, huckeben, hockeny, all meaning a lie or to lie, deception and humbug. Now, the great trick, Leland insisted, was brought by the gypsies from the East and has been practiced by them all over the world. Now, we should immediately dismiss the claim that con games involving hidden treasure or money magic were imported to Europe by Romanis. As Johannes Dillinger has shown, such tricks grew out of medieval traditions of magical treasure hunting and thus predate the European Romani diaspora by several centuries. Stories of treasure tricksters became a stock in trade of European folklore from the 16th century onwards, and it was only against this backdrop that gypsies too became associated with such deceits, although never exclusively. But my aim here is not simply about debunking notions of Hokanobaro. We must, of course, fully reject the larger diffusionist narrative about gypsies importing fraudulent or superstitious practices to a pious but naive Christian Europe. That much is clear. But on the other side, we must also acknowledge two things. First, that some Romani women have historically set up as magical service providers. And secondly, that techniques of deception and sleight of hand appear to have played a role in this entrepreneurial magical practice. So what I will do in this lecture is to probe questions of how and why such deception was deployed. And I'll do that by bringing you a bit closer to some of the practitioners that we can have some documentation of with the help of lively archival material. We'll get to that a bit later in the lecture. But before delving in, I should also make some further key assumptions and perspectives transparent. Make three clarifications in particular. First, I have already been using difficult and problematic terminology, such as gypsies on the one hand and then Roma or Romanis on the other. It is crucial to distinguish very clearly between these terms. So first of all, the term gypsies is always meant in scare quotes, and it refers not to a people, but to a set of stereotyped identities, a construct that is often ascribed from the outside in a derogatory way, but sometimes also performed to the outside. By contrast, Roma or Romanis is meant here as an ethnonym, or at least a loose reference to a set of related ethnic minorities across Europe. More specifically, since my focus is on Northwestern Europe in the early modern period, I am dealing quite specifically with the Northwestern Romani groups, that is to say, the ancestors of present-day Sinti, Manouche, Romanical, Romanisal, Kale, Calais, and so on. Notably, this means that I have nothing to say here really about groups related to the great Calderash migration to Northern and Western Europe that followed the late 19th century abolition of slavery in the Danubian principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. This is an important clarification given the different histories, identities, and traditions of the groups that are nowadays sorted under the umbrella Roma. So I wanted to make that clear up front. Secondly, it is among these Northwestern Romani groups that I see traces of a tradition in which deception, sleight of hand, and clever narrative framing accompanied the selling of magical services to non-Romanis. Now, the context of this tradition is the wider European magical service economy. That is to say, the ever-existing demand for out-of-the-ordinary solutions in domains like health, love, or the success or failure of crops. Some Romani women, who were understood as exotic strangers from Little Egypt by the majority population, appear to have set up as entrepreneurs on this market already in the 15th century. Through constant adaptation and improvisation to meet the local demand and to compete also with existing providers, this meant absorbing and reshaping already existing magical folklore through an expanding portfolio of services. Finally, this takes me to the heart of the lecture's topic, namely the role of deception in entrepreneurial magic at large. So, talk of deception in context of the religious or magical tends to evoke distinctions between genuine practitioners and impostors. That dichotomy is, however, problematic. The human propensity to temporarily suspend disbelief in the face of the obviously artificial or hyperbolically exaggerated, that is to say, to temporarily affirm the world as if it is like this, is as central to religion as it is to the enjoyment of theater or film. Artifice and suspension are in fact key to some of the most stereotypically authentic features of the religious repertoire. Experiencing the presence of gods and spirits is, for instance, less about some mysterious eruption of the sacred than the outcome of elaborate learning processes through which stories, materiality, and embodied practices tweak one's expectations and kindle experiences of presence and eventually give rise to stories and belief narratives about such encounters and presences. Now, in critiques of religion, and especially in the dismissal of foreign or deviant or new religious practices, or magical practices for that matter, artifice often becomes indicative of fraud. So shamanism is an illuminating case here, or at least the history of the concept of shamanism. 18th century conceptions of the Tungus shaman highlighted his obvious feats of deception, describing him as a juggler, a fraud, and an impostor. Not unlike contemporaneous depictions of gypsy women as fraudulent fortune tellers, it should be noted. There is a kinship here in the representation of these types of ritual experts or entrepreneurs. By contrast, when in the 20th century Mircea Eliade elevated the shaman to an archetypical virtuoso of the religious experience, wielding archaic techniques of ecstasy, he completely omitted the element of deception. The logic remained either or. If you're authentic, you cannot be dealing with any kind of deception. Now, more recent attempts to come to terms with the ethnographic record have required anthropologists to overcome the dichotomy between sincerity and deception. Michael Tausig, for instance, talks of the trick as technique and substitutes terms like simulation and mimesis for deception and fraud. On this view, the shaman's tricks simulate desired actions in the spirit world. Individual shamans compete to develop the most ingenious and spectacular performative displays. The patients and onlookers know full well that what they are seeing is, in a trivial sense at least, a spectacle of dexterity and nimble-fingeredness, but simultaneously they take this spectacle as demonstrations of power in the other world. So, informed by these discussions, I will argue that the deployment of deceptive techniques in service magic should be viewed as artifices of magical power, illusions that persuade the customer of the practitioner's skill and the magic's efficacy. The persuasive force, however, lies not only in dazzling spectators with seemingly impossible displays, although that is an important part of it. More importantly, perhaps, they manifest a story world. These performances evoke folkloric expectations on magic by simulating them, visibly and tangibly, in dramatic ways. So together, the magician and the client weave powerful belief narratives about the efficacy and reality of magic. Now, at the same time, the service magician who engineers these marvelous effects and stages the performance is also placed in a position of epistemological privilege vis-à-vis their clients. They alone know how it is done. Now, for Romani practitioners who were only practitioners by virtue of adopting and performing a stereotyped role, namely the stereotype of the gypsy with mystical magical powers, this epistemic privilege made service magic more than a purely entrepreneurial practice. It also afforded a form of resistance that performatively exposed the prejudices and superstitions of society's dominant groups. In short, unveiling and exposing the trick let them weave their own negational belief narratives that cast the majority in a different light. So these are kind of the main points that inform my discussion also of the material as we now move forward. Part 2, Egyptians and the Art of Juggling. Today we tend to make a sharp distinction between the skilled illusions of stage magic and the kinds of magic to which people attribute real efficacy. However, techniques aiming simply to entertain or prank an audience have in fact always existed side by side with the serious kinds that scholars of magic tend to highlight. In the Greco-Roman world, we have the wonder workers or thaumatopouoi, using conjuring tricks and clever illusions. And in the Greek magical papyri, we find a list of illusions and pranks known as Democritus's table tricks, the pagnia. Courtly jugglers and performers existed throughout the Middle Ages, while tricks, pranks, and illusions were recorded in household encyclopedias and collections of medical and magical lore. Now, we still know very little about how medieval traditions of performance magic relate to the serious kind to which people attributed magical efficacy. The case of gypsies or Egyptians in the early modern period offers some clues to this, because they were in fact also inscribed prominently in early folklore about the origins of the juggling arts. And this is where I will begin. Now, this happened in late 16th century England. Reginald Scott's discovery of witchcraft attributes the game of fast and loose to Egyptians and provides instructions for how to perform, quote, some of their particular feats. In one trick, the ends of a handkerchief are made to look like it is tied with knots, but, quote, after some words used and wagers laid, they take the handkerchief and shake it, and it will be loose. In another, bead stones threaded onto two doubled cords are made to look as if they jump off the cord by magic. And Scott noted that the sortilegium, or fortune-telling of these counterfeit Egyptians, standard term for Romanis in Britain in this period, had, quote, no small credit among the multitude. Their divinations, however, were as their fast and loose, that is to say, pure trickery and deception. Other English authors would follow Scott's lead and suggest that the entire art of performance magic had been brought by the Egyptians to the British Isles. The Art of Juggling, or Legerdemain, from 1612, for instance, this is a short work by a certain Samuel Ridd. It opened with the story of how certain Egyptians who had been banished from their country came to England and were spoken of far and near for being so excellent in quaint tricks and devices not known here at that time. They traveled around the country, practicing their cozening art of fast and loose and legerdemain, purchased to themselves great credit among the country people. Ridd added that some of them deserve commendation for the nimbleness and agility of their hands, and might be thought to perform as excellent things by their legerdemain as any of your wizards, witches, or magicians whatsoever. Notably, the Egyptians, quote, perform that in action, which the others only make show of. The illusions of the Egyptians are, in other words, more impressive than the magic of wizards and witches. Now, this narrative was developed further in the illustrated Hocus Pocus Junior, a valuable early source to performance magic that was first published in 1634 and reprinted many times and still also held dear by contemporary stage magicians today. The Egyptian jugglers, it said, had eventually been joined by diverse English vagrants who had, quote, in time learned both the language and cozening delusions, end of quote. So the tricks had, in other words, come from Egypt via the gypsies, but had since been taken over by ordinary English vagrants and street performers who now pretended to be gypsies. That is to say, this notion of counterfeit Egyptians. Now, what are we to make of these stories? Um, at the time that this literature emerged, Romanis had been in the British Isles for at least 3 generations. First documented presence is from 1505, uh, and endured 3 waves of targeted anti-gypsy legislation that singled them out precisely for allegedly deceiving the people. So legislation had first ordered their expulsion from the realm, the 1531 Egyptians Act. Then the assimilation of those born in the country in 1554, and finally also the punishment of those non-gypsies who had joined their ranks, 1562. To some extent, then, authors like Scott and Ridd merely parroted the views of legislators, but they also revealed a popular fascination with the Egyptians' reputation as jugglers and tricksters. Now, what matters particularly in our context is Scott's and Ridd's suggestion that the counterfeit Egyptians would blend highly skilled juggling tricks with practices that were packaged as real magic. Ridd held that these made them more convincing than wizards and magicians, as we've seen. There was little wonder, he added, that people would, quote, attribute it to be done by the devil when indeed it is nothing else but mere illusion. Now, this combination of deception and service magic can, I argue, be substantiated by looking beyond the English context to consider evidence from the related Scandinavian population of Romani known at the time as in Scandinavia as Tatara, or also as Zigenare or Zigeuner. And more specifically, to turn to the tradition known as Summipa. And this takes me then to part 3, Summipa. So I have already noted that Eilert Sundt connected Burroughs' Hokanobaro to what his interlocutors called Summipa, a noun bearing the double meaning of witchcraft or magic on the one hand and deception or fraud on the other. With the help of his most important Romani informant, Fredrik Larsen Hartmann, Sundt presented something of a typology of Summipa practices. Rupeske Summipa, the silver trick, was equivalent to Burroughs' examples of fraudulent Hokanobaro. A magical ceremony required the client to bring out all the best silverware, which the practitioner would eventually run away with. But at the core of the tradition stood a range of much subtler tricks than this, bearing names such as Drabbeske Summipa, the poison trick, Taveske Summipa, the thread trick, and Kiel Summipa, butter trick. These deployed deception in order to persuade potential clients of the practitioner's power, or to persuade them of the urgent need for magical protection. Embedded within magical services such as curing people and livestock, or especially and particularly in unbewitching services and counter magic, these subtle tricks were capable of making widespread folkloric expectations tangible in startling and often quite uncanny ways. Now, Sundt himself provided some examples of Summipa, but luckily we do not have to rely on him alone. Almost all of the types that Sundt mentioned, and additional ones as well, are found in Swedish court records going back to the early 18th century. In this material, women Tattare describe the variations of the tricks, explain how they were performed, and in some cases even demonstrate them in court. The records also provide insights into the context of the services, who the clients were, and how the services were understood. So we must keep in mind, of course, that this material suffers from an obvious selection bias. By definition, we only have access to cases where the client was eventually dissatisfied or claimed to have been cheated and defrauded. Nevertheless, the material sheds light on how ritual deception mixed with narrative framing to produce an aura of authenticity that in many cases must have been quite persuasive, even contributing to a sense of efficacy and magic power. So in what follows, I will use examples from the archives that shed light on three aspects of this. So first, on how existing magical folklore is activated through the narrative framing of the practitioner and the ritual event. And second, how the manifestation of impossible effects are used to demonstrate magical power. And third, how to the practitioner, all of this provided a temporary sense of empowerment and performative resistance that occasionally was revealed also in court. Now, taken together, these put the spotlight on the active weaving and unweaving of belief narratives related to the folk magical domain on the one hand, and to stereotypes of the gypsy and their powers on the other. We begin then with the folkloric narrative framing. One folkloric motif that has a close connection to beliefs about cunning folk and their powers concerns the white snake. Belief narratives from across the Nordic and Baltic area connect the act of consuming the white snake, whether eating its flesh and fat or boiling it and drinking the broth, to the acquisition of second sight and related abilities. This motif is well known also across Europe, but also including in the folkloric literatures of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Estonia. Now, both Sunt and earlier Swedish court material show how Romani women could actively use this belief to market their services. In one case from Småland in 1778, Maja Lindvall, who belongs to a central Swedish-Norwegian Romani family lineage, claimed that the white snake had made her so wise that she could foresee the future and prevent misfortune. Maya's clients didn't have to take her word for it, however. She brought pieces of the white snake with her, which she even offered to clients as amulets that would protect livestock from witchcraft. The skeletal remains of this exotic creature were also displayed in court, where Maya, however, explained that this was really just the jaw and teeth of a rayfish, rocka, that was given to her by fishermen. So now, half a century later, Sundt revealed much the same thing. His interlocutor Hartmann had told him that the Tatar women of Norway would collect rays discarded by fishermen on the coast, cut out their skulls, bleach them in the sun, and include their jaws with the other apothecary items as they moved inland. In this case, we may in fact be dealing with a specific family tradition. Hartmann was close to the Tatar woman Johanne Louise Glad, who was widely rumored in Norway for her magical arts, and who also figured in some of the stories that Hartmann fed to Sundt, and that kind of Sundt was building his notion of Sumpa on. Now, this woman, Johanne Louise Glad, is the granddaughter of Maja Lindvall, who walked around Småland with the white snake in the 1770s. So this is an example of how a tradition is passed down, perhaps. Now, the white snake exemplifies how the credibility of the magical service provider was enhanced through a combination of narrative framing and the display of material objects that activated well-established folkloric beliefs. So in this case, the jaws of a rayfish, teeth row of the rayfish looking like the skeleton of a white snake. Now, feats of illusion and sleight of hand were used in much the same way. They allow the practitioner to not only tell clients about supernatural threats and their magical solutions, but to show them in sometimes dramatic and shocking ways. Good examples of this are found in what Sundt and Hartmann called Taveske Sumipa, the thread trick, and Kiel Sumipa, butter trick. The thread trick relates to widespread folklore about magical knots. While we encountered the trick in many varieties, it predominantly relates to folk magical practices of tying away disease. It also somehow recalls Reginald Scott's remark that the gypsies' magic was like their fast and loose, as he put it. For while folk magical practices revolve around the ritualized tying and untying of knots, Taviske Sumipa involved the mysterious disappearance of knots in front of the client's eyes, an effect that was achieved by sleight of hand, such as deftly substituting one thread for another. Now, if the thread trick combined a well-known magical procedure with a startling and surprising effect, the butter trick added a dimension of supernatural terror. Typically performed in a diagnostic sequence of an unbewitching service, it demonstrated the presence of a looming magical danger by turning butter, milk, or some other dairy product into blood through stirring it with a knife. The effect was achieved by secretly coating the knife with red chalk, a simple yet powerful illusion that required both dexterity and misdirection, since the knife was usually also to be provided directly by the client for extra surprising effect. Now, court records provide a number of examples of these tricks, which could be performed in combination. There is no better way of illustrating this than turning to one of their veritable masters, Anna Sophia Adamsdotter. Anna Sophia was born around 1714 or 1715, probably in Denmark. Court records describe her variously as a gypsy, a tartare, and as a black woman who spoke Swedish with a Norwegian accent. We find her answering to courts across southern, eastern, and middle Sweden in the mid-18th century, describing her practice of taveske and kielsumipa. But she also describes, or we also see how she peddled in folk medical remedies. For example, she brought with her dried hedgehog's liver, which was given as an amulet to be worn around the neck to protect against fever. While a snake skull, an ormskalle, was also carried around for children to drink milk from, protecting against all sorts of illnesses. Now, Anna Sophia practiced her arts widely with clients from different social strata and facing a range of problems. A typical pattern, however, at least in the records that we have, bearing in mind the selection bias again, is that she would persuade clients that their problems were caused by witchcraft and proceed to offer counter magic. One such case from Öland in 1757 involves the wife of a priest, Märta Beata Lundvall, and her daughter, who were both sick. In order for Anna Sophia to cure them, Märta had to bring out some fine thread, which was cut into several pieces. Märta was given 2 threads and asked to tie 9 knots on them, 9 knots on each of the 2 threads. Anna Sophia took the threads and held them up, so with the knots, and asking that the sick mother and the child both blow on these threads and knots. If the knots disappeared, then they would both get well. Otherwise, their condition would remain. They blew, and the knots were untied, or seemed to be untied. You see, Anna Sophia then said, that if I can do this, I can also do more. Next, Anna Sophia ordered Märta to quickly get some sour cream in a silver spoon, lest the knots tie themselves again. Anna Sophia placed the sour cream in the sick girl's palm, got a knife from Märta's table, and stirred. The priest's wife saw how the sour cream turned bloody. This ominous sign meant that they both would be bedridden and spit blood for 3 years. And the cause of it all was witchcraft, Anna Sophia told them. Now, an elaborate set of actions to counter the witch then followed. Märta was to gather clothes worn by herself and her daughter in church, along with money and other valuables. And this was put in a bowl of water mixed with the blood-stained sour cream, with some bread and salt and 2 straws, while Anna Sophia invoked the names of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, along with other incantations. The valuables were then retrieved from the bowl and wrapped in the sick girl's sweater. Finally, Anna Sophia proposed to carry these away, and with them the curse. Within 9 weeks, she said, the witch who had put the sickness on them would come to pay a handsome sum of money for the damages, of which Anna Sophia would only charge a small percentage as payment for her services. Now, the same combination of tricks was practiced on a farmer and his wife in 1764 in Askeby, where Anna Sophia was traveling with a young relative named Elsa. 9 knots had disappeared in front of the farmer and his wife. This proved that bad magic was at work in their household. Now you can see that as certainly as these knots are gone, so are you and your husband bewitched with all that you have on your farm. Butter, cheese, and milk was brought out, which all turned to blood when Anna Sophia, chanting in a strange language, cut the dairy products with a knife. And this meant that they would both cough blood for 9 years. Anna Sophia could, however, with some of her own powers, stop the witch and transfer the curse onto 2 hens, which she could then run away with to protect them. Now, in the court case about this Askeby case in 1764, Anna Sophia was asked to provide a demonstration of how she had performed the illusions that had so terrified the farmer and his wife. The magistrates were apparently quite impressed. The records note that she skillfully behended it, made the knotted thread disappear, and also that she coated her knife with chalk, unnoticed, oförmärkt, and repeated this feat when they gave her a new knife. So they wanted her to repeat it again, and she did, and they were impressed. Now, these particular cases, Öland here and Askeby, they obviously did include an element of what could be characterized as fraud, in the sense that the practitioner attempted to run away with more than the agreed price. But the point here is that the details invite us to look beyond the selection bias to imagine what a typical non-recorded interaction might have looked like. To begin with, women like Anna Sophia must have caught an impressive and somewhat intimidating figure. They were often wandering apothecaries, carrying exotic remedies and cures that, whether they worked or not, would have been in demand and appreciated. It is not hard to imagine that the spectacular ritualized diagnosis of experienced problems through the thread and butter tricks offered a psychologically powerful way to deal with and overcome various hardships. If we view these artifices of magical power not simply as fraudulent tricks, but as techniques of persuasion and real making, showing how magic is real, then the Romani entrepreneurs emerge as virtuosi of magical folklore, actively weaving and supporting belief narratives through kindling their clients' experience that magic really works. That, I hold, is an important part of the story, but it is not the whole story. Now, the active and successful kindling of belief in others does not preclude a form of dissimulation that could be cast as fraudulent. And in closing, I would like to throw some further light on this issue. My key point here is that even in cases where the practitioner has no intention of leaving the customer satisfied, the concept of fraud is not the most useful lens. Fraud suggests that the aim of the deception and dissimulation is material gain on a victim's expense. However, the real gain of summipa is something less material. It is the key aim for the practitioners is, I believe, the production of negational belief narratives that reveal, contradict, and ridicule the superstitions of the otherwise dominant majority population, and that do this by actively playing on their expectations and their prejudices. It constitutes a kind of performative resistance, generating stories of defiance that are passed down within the group and might help to solidify group cohesion and identity. Now, there is in fact, a philological clue to this function of summipa. So in the Scandinavian context, the verb summa is first attested in 1801 in a trial record with the alleged meaning of to defraud someone of the money. Now, Sund, as we have seen, recorded the double meaning of fraud and sorcery, Whereas Arthur Tesleff, in his work among Finnish Kaleroma in the late 19th century, recorded the verb zumava and the noun zumiba, meaning simply to do sorcery, or rather, actually, he writes zaubern bei Zigeuner. So basically, when the gypsies do magic, it is called zumiba, which is an interesting clue also. Now, the etymology of the term is not entirely clear, but other Romani dialects suggest that the term originally had a different meaning altogether. So we can turn to Samson's work on the archaic Welsh dialect, which is sort of the gold standard of these northern branches of Romani. Samson, he recorded the verb zumava, meaning to interrogate, to question, or to examine and to test, with the noun zumaviben meaning interrogation, inquiry, questioning, examination. So the development of summa and summipa from an original meaning of testing someone reveals, I think, something of the tradition's internal cultural function, testing people's judgments, credulity, and so on. And this is really at the essence here. So, but finally, beyond philology, I also want to call on a final witness, namely Anna Maria Adamsdotter, who has recently emerged as a key source of Romani life in the Nordics in the early modern period due to her many provocative appearances in Swedish trials in the early 1700s. Born around 1680, probably in Frankfurt, she spoke French and German in addition to Swedish and Romani. She traded in horses, which was untypical for women, but also in handicrafts and raw materials, as well as in medicine and magic. She survived no fewer than 3 death sentences in 1709 in Karlskrona, 1711 in Gothenburg, 1724 in Gävle. And including one of these death sentences was also based in Sweden's explicit anti-gypsy legislation of 1662. So she's also a very clear kind of victim of anti-gypsy policies and repression. And she also survived 2 attempts at deportation, one to Norway and the other to Russia. So her resilience was, in other words, remarkable. Anna Maria has, beyond this, also given us 2 unique specimens of early modern Romani cultural heritage, namely a skull-shaped artifact carved from bone and the earliest known authentic dictation of Romani, which is recorded in one of the trials where she appears. Both of these, moreover, are tied to the practice of summipa. Now, like the aforementioned Anna Sophia, who may in fact have been Anna Maria's much younger half-sister, we don't know for sure, Anna Maria spoke freely and at length about her techniques, even in court cases where she was not accused of anything to do with magic, such as in Karlskrona in 1709, when she was actually initially accused of having stolen 7 pairs of socks from a market stall on Christmas Eve. Nevertheless, she started talking about magic and described some spectacular and striking feats, while consistently ridiculing the superstitious and simple-minded people who believed in such things. So, for example, when she said that when she came to the estates of wealthy farmers or priests, she would offer them help with getting rid of their rodents, which was a typical problem. And she would then demonstrate her powers in this area by smuggling live mice in a concealed box under her clothes and releasing these mice into a barrel by sleight of hand to make it seem that she could summon these rodents and imprison them and thus carry them away. Now, when it comes to the skull-shaped bone figure, which you see here and which has been identified at the Nordic Museum in Stockholm and can now be viewed in their permanent exhibition, Anna Maria explained that this was yet another effectful prop in the diagnostic phase of an unbewitching service. So she would make this kind of ominous figure, which also had hairs attached to it with pitch. She would make them appear from under the thresholds of barns and so on. But more impressively, she would make them appear from within an egg. This, she said, made the clients strengthened in their belief. And she had learned all of this from her mother and was now teaching it to her daughters. And indeed, so speaking of tradition here, versions of these techniques of the egg trick, making mysterious objects appear from within an egg that is cracked open, can be found later on among other Northwestern Romani groups. For example, in the Netherlands, later in the 18th century, in Germany in the 19th century, and in Poland in the 20th century. Now, importantly, Anna Maria also gave a valuable clue to the use of Romani language in these rituals. Before the egg was cracked to reveal the little devil inside, or just as the mice were about to magically appear in the jar, she would utter some words in the gypsy language. To clients, these would appear like an exotic formula or charm, yet another index of the gypsy sorceress's power. But since Anna Maria's Romani phrases were recorded in the trial documents, however, we know that in reality the reading masked a series of obscene invectives, essentially a practical joke on the client's expense that also expressed some of the anger, frustration, and pent-up resentment against the majority population, no doubt. Now, in conclusion, the picture of the tradition of Summipa that is now forming puts the old gypsylorist ideas of Håkon Obaro as a foreign import that reveals the essence of the gypsies as Orientals within in a very different light. It is true that we are dealing with a tradition, but it is a tradition that is thoroughly European, premised on bringing local folklore to life, adapting and responding to the fears, desires, and beliefs of the majority population. In fact, Sebastian Münster may in some sense have gotten closer to the tradition's core when he stated in 1550 that gypsies have deceivers among them who, quote, impose by strange yet simple techniques and persuade people of things that do not exist in nature or that they themselves have never seen. So this emphasis on persuasion is important here. So by highlighting the dimension of persuasion, of making the impossible present, Summipa also casts new light on European service magic at large, a field that has only recently started to get more systematic attention. In particular, it highlights the interconnectedness of performance magic, and serious service magic. Like in so-called shamanic practice, the trick is a technique that manifests rather than only feigning otherworldly power. The performance of gypsiness, moreover, that we've seen in some of these cases, opens a window onto the magical service economy's role as a site for negotiations of ethnicity and ethnic boundaries. Now, the subversiveness of these performances in the tradition of Summipa reminds us that to the resourceful and resilient, even heavy stereotypes can provide a source of agency and resistance. Thank you.